Hi, my name is Chris Smith. I am 35 years old. I'm an engineer, an entrepreneur in the tech industry. And there was about 3 or 4 years where I was deeply seeking to try and understand uh, what was true, what was life about, what was my purpose. And through that journey, I explored deep into psychedelics and mushrooms and ayahuasca and DMT, into yoga retreats and following gurus and trying different mantra practices and tantra practices, and went to weeks of silent meditation retreats and got into energy healing and crystals and astrology. And I was basically throwing anything and everything at the wall to see what would stick. And ultimately, it led me to faith in Jesus Christ. And so this is my story of how I got here. So I grew up in a Christian family, probably from about the time I was 7 or 8 till maybe 13 or 14. So there was some trauma early in my childhood around alcoholism, but ultimately the church was a really safe place for me as I was growing up. And it wasn't until started to get into my teens that I started to really question, like, wh- how can hell exist? And why is it that I, being born in the US or Tennessee, why should I get to go to heaven when people in India or China don't have access to that? And it felt really unfair. And I couldn't get behind the idea of why hell even existed. And I think, yeah, I just started to really question things. And I couldn't find any real satisfactory answers other than people saying, well, that's just the way it is. And yeah, so I stopped going to church and started to really explore and be more open to really any other worldly paths. And that led me to, when I was in college, to be a lot more open to things like starting to read Eckhart Tolle's books on the power of now, or doing some meditations or yoga type Hinduistic practices, or trying psychedelics, and ultimately got into a partying lifestyle and just did whatever I wanted to do. And I'd say I was in that season, I became agnostic and spiritually open. And I studied engineering and business. And when I graduated, I had a really good job out of school. So I moved to Austin, Texas, and did that for a while and moved back to the Southeast. And would really say I wasn't really practicing anything spiritually at that time other than living a worldly life and maybe going to some yoga classes. But a few years after college, I really started questioning a lot more, like, what am I doing here? Like, what is life about? What should I be doing? And questioning, what is my purpose? And that led me to quit the job I was at and start to kind of really question, okay, do I want to start a business in, pursuing some passions of mine, and maybe go travel more and see the world? And so as I was doing that, my dad passed away in that same time while I was traveling. And so it took 3 or 4 days to get back to my home and go to the funeral and do all of the funeral things. So I was home for about 2 weeks and I kind of did the things I needed to do, but I really didn't know how to feel grief at that point or to go through the grieving process. And I think some of that was because of the wounds of maybe growing up in an alcoholic family, or probably just lineage of trauma and emotional maybe unavailability or low EQ, I would say, in my family. And yeah, so that really like kind of, I'd say, accelerated my path of questioning and also increased my own internal sense of suffering. And so I really tried to live a more worldly life after that for a while, just partying more and making good money and traveling all over. But it really started to catch up with me, and I really started to feel a depth of kind of internal suffering and this pain in my heart around, like, what am I doing? And that ultimately led me, I moved to San Francisco around that time and was doing some tech consulting work and eventually worked at a startup out there. But all the while, I didn't feel good. And so I was constantly questioning why. So I'd start to read more about genetics and did genetic profiling, and thought maybe, because I'm at this point in life, I'm very much a materialist for the most part, like an engineer thinking about everything's physical. It comes together in certain ways, and there must be some sort of chemical that's off inside my brain. And I just need to be able to tweak that in some way with supplements or nootropics or diet and rest. And all those things are important. But the more I tried to tinker with things on my own, the more I felt off. And so that led me in the direction of psychedelics, of saying, or at least hearing about people discussing how psychedelics could be used for healing and for spiritual exploration and for creative growth. And I had tried mushrooms a couple times in college, and so I was like, okay, I'll go down this path. And I also started going to Burning Man at that time, which is a big festival in the desert. That's where I started to explore more deeply into sort of spiritualism, I would say, and psychedelics especially. And I would find that I'd often, while going on the psychedelic journeys, I would start to get really existential and question and feel this anxiety of like, what am I doing here? Like, what is this all about? And the second year I went, and at this time, trying things like mushrooms and LSD and MDMA, and kind of, I'd say, half partying, half exploring consciousness, exploring my own experience of reality and trying to enjoy life. But this nagging thing is weighing on me. I'm like, what am I doing here? What is this all about? And there was a night at Burning Man where had done acid, and maybe 12 hours later, so like at the tail end of this trip, I get in touch with a level of grief that I didn't know I could feel. And I wept. I wept all night long, and people supported me and listened to me, and I talked to people about purpose and life, and something really, I'd say, this dam opened up in me that night, and I got in touch with emotions that I didn't know how to feel. And I felt so open and free the next day that I was like, wow, psychedelics must be the thing that I need. When in retrospect, I really need to grieve and to get in touch with my emotions. But they really knocked me open. But they also, at that point, I started to put more faith into psychedelics as a means of spiritual growth. And so I started pursuing that more fully, and going to, like, went to some ayahuasca ceremonies after that, which is a weekend ceremony, and you drink this Amazonian kind of herbal mixture that leads to really like full body hallucinations and mystical spiritual experiences, and you're sitting kind of with a group for 6 or 7 hours at a time. And this season kind of really like shook me. It shook my materialist mind, took me for a loop, I would say. Like, it was getting harder and harder to believe that the world was strictly material, was strictly hard physical things that were all scientifically measurable. I've had some experiences with those substances that led me to be like, okay, I can't explain this in any other way other than there must be some immaterial, like non-physical aspect of life. And that led me to quit the job I was at the time, be like, I need to explore this. And I was looking at how do you apply virtual reality to help people learn or have these type of experiences, but without the substances. And so me and a friend started a business looking at how do you use VR to teach meditation or biofeedback, help people to get in touch with their breathing or learn to manage their heart rate variability or feel connected to other people. And then also to implement these types of Buddhist meditation practices that I had started to try. And so as I was going down that path, I left the job and I sold a house I had at the time, and I had a lot of time and money to dive into these things. And I really wanted to know, like, what am I doing here? And this felt like it was taking me in the right path. And so I dove into it head on. And I'd say with a little bit of a scientific mind about it, of like, I'm going to try things and do these small experiments and see what my experience is out of that. And so started going to ayahuasca retreats, started going to silent Buddhist meditation retreats, starting out with like a metta loving kindness practice, which is a type of meditation that you imagine yourself sending out love and peace and joy to people around you, ultimately to all people everywhere, all beings. And I started to have more mystical experiences in these retreats of stuff that was hard to explain, like visionary stuff or crazy sensations or senses of things opening up or shifting in my consciousness. And so I assumed that meant I was moving in the right direction. So really doubled down on that. And psychedelics, after having that experience of getting in touch with grief, I really doubled down on them and tried other types of psychedelics. And at the, I guess it was probably fall 2016, I had an extremely dark experience in an ayahuasca retreat. And this is like, I just read this book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is about how sort of trauma lives in the body and how healing happens, but also how the unconscious holds on to these unresolved emotions and that kind of thing. And so in this psychedelic retreat, I'm there, and this really deeply, I'd say, evil in retrospect, but like hard, just challenging, like oppressive kind of force came onto me, over me, and I was like, "Oh, this must be some sort of trauma, and I need to, like, press into it and feel it and be with it." And it kept getting worse and worse, and to the point where it felt like almost like a spiritual rape in a sense, and I was like, but there was nowhere I could go and nothing I could do. And I sort of waved over one of the people that is helping kind of run this kind of a program, and they whatever fan some feathers over me and say some incantation or something, and but I was totally overwhelmed, not to the point of like losing a grip on reality, but like really deeply questioning what was going on, and taking ownership of this experience and being like, oh, there must be something wrong with me. Like there's some sort of darkness that I need to feel or process. And so I left that retreat the next day or two and was like, what was that about? And so I found a guy who did MDMA therapy sessions and went and did this MDMA session with him. And MDMA it's more of a party drug, but it also gets used in ther- therapy clinics to help people with trauma. It basically turns off some of the fear centers in the brain, as I think is the experience of it, and so it helps you to feel hard to feel emotions. And so I go to this MDMA therapy session and go through this whole kind of ritual around it and create the space and prepare for it and kind of fast the day before. And I have this take this MDMA, and literally the only thing I feel is just a sense of like almost like being in touch with another being that was kind of like malevolent, but then kind of like getting connected to this thing and not knowing what was going on, or if that was me or me in a higher realm. Or it was confusing ultimately. And so I left that retreat or that therapy session, and the next week, I don't know, it's probably 3 weeks later or so, Burning Man was happening again. And so I went there, and I had heard about this other intense psychedelic drug called 5-MeO, DMT. And I figured this is supposed to be a really profound experience that people have, and it kind of puts you in touch with death and leaving your body and leaving sort of this realm, if you will. And I had this moment of being like, oh, maybe I should do that. Maybe that will help me push through this weird experience I just had. And so I'm still very much grabbing onto this kind of a materialistic, kind of mechanistic thing. And I just need these chemicals to kind of push me through the hard things I faced to get to a better place. And so midway through Burning Man, I just had this weird experience at Burning Man. And then at one point, I'm at this little kind of tea lounge, and I'm talking to this guy about some spiritual stuff. And I was very much leaning into this kind of yoga Hindu perspective on reality of we're all God. Like all of this, all of experience is God, sort of pantheism of I'm God, you're God, we're God. And I said that, and he sort of stopped me, and he was like we're not God. Like I'm not God. And I was like, oh, okay, whatever. Like that doesn't. I'm sort of trying to step into this worldview, and it was a funny moment, but there was kind of this weird inclination in me that was just like a off feeling, I could say. And so I started talking about this 5-MeO substance, and he said, oh, I have some, and he helped people guide people through these types of journeys before. And so I'm like, okay, this must be a sign. So I go back to my camp, and no one's there. And so I'm like, okay, I'll try this drug with this person, which in retrospect sounds completely absurd. But at this point, I'm just like deeply searching and willing to do anything to find truth and to find peace and resolution for the offness I feel inside. And so I go to my tent or yurt, it's basically a little hut, and he brings his guitar and he's sort of playing this kind of like spiritual tune, and so I'm about to smoke this substance, and it's supposed to be basically the most intense psychedelic trip you can experience. And I talked to friends that had done it and said it was really profound to them. And so I sort of say a prayer. I would say it wasn't, I'd say a faithful prayer in a sense of like a Christian sense is more of like a sort of, I'd say probably more from my upbringing, like, God, what is enlightenment? Like, I really want to know what enlightenment is. And so I prayed that, and I felt this kind of tightening in my heart of like, it kind of was saying, don't do it. And I was like, I need to push through. I need to break through. And so I smoked this substance, and within seconds, it was like the whole world collapsed, and I was on. And like, it was just the only thing I remembered kind of coming out of it was I was trying to sort of grasp onto anything and feeling like, oh no, I just killed myself. I'm never going to see my mom or my brother again. And it was like, and I was gone. And then, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes later, I come back, and it's like a zap back into my body, and I stand up, and I'm like, holy crap, what just happened? And I like literally pick the guy up, and I'm like so happy to be back in my body, and I'm like touching the walls, and everything's really intense for a few moments. And there's this weird kind of imagery around some Buddhist stuff on the way back to my body is was the experience. And so I come out of that, and I feel like, what just happened? Like, did I just die? And I felt off, even more off, and in some sense, like kind of more numb and dead inside. And I was like, man, what happened? And I like couldn't grasp what had just happened. But I kind of came to the terms of like, I need to stop doing psychedelics and trying to push myself. So I get back from Burning Man and I feel off. It's harder to concentrate. I feel more scatterbrained. And so it's harder to focus on the business, the virtual reality business. And albeit we are starting to have some success, we were working with some big universities like Stanford and Cornell, and had some success working with a children's hospital and some virtual reality experiences for them to use for kids. And it was like there was so much going on spiritually for me that I was just like, I can't focus on this. And so the guy I was working with kind of went and traveled for a while, and I was left questioning like, what's going on? What is this spiritual realm? Like, what are these experiences of beings, of imagery, of evil, of bliss? And so I decided to kind of slow down, put the business on the sort of side, and dive full on into it. And in this period, I was also starting to like wake up and have these kind of really crazy experiences in the middle of the night. Like, I remember feeling like there were beings like visiting me in the middle of the night, or like energy. It was like a perception of energies and things. And it just like led me in this path of like, wow, like what does everyone say about this? Like how what is grounding in a spiritual sense? And I felt scattered, I would say. And so I was trying to sort of figure out how do I ground myself. And so I went to like a Chinese medicine person, and he made this like Chinese herbal tea that was sort of grounded in Chinese medicine and their perspective on energy flows in the body. I started going to a chiropractor, or not a chiropractor, acupuncturist, and talking to them about it. And they would get these sort of images and share these spiritual images with me while I was there. And it was sort of seemingly helpful, but it also kind of left me feeling kind of spiritually off. And met some friends who were going to these energy healers who had these profound gifts. And so at one point, I had this experience with an energy healer where this person was like snapping and doing stuff. And I feel like stuff moving inside me while this person is doing this. And I like cry, but also these like my body wants to do all this crazy stuff. And I'm like, wow, this person knows how to navigate in this spiritual territory. And so I was like, that must be it. Like to know how to navigate in the spiritual realm, like this is someone who's someone I can learn a lot from. And so I joined this energy healing program with some friends, and it's like $10,000, and it's like you go 4 days a week or 4 weekends, 4 day weekends once a quarter, and so it's like 18 months. And it led me to diving even more intensely into this world, and everyone's sort of pursuing sort of Buddhist meditation practices and yoga practices and qigong and some psychedelics and crystals. And so I started reading about crystals and how the different crystals apply to spirituality and healing. And so, but like next thing I know, I'm like deep into this whole world and having experiences that are sort of mimicking the types of things that I'm reading about in these spiritual books about crystals or about energy healing or about channeling or about all these different things. And so I start to really believe in this idea of reincarnation, of sort of light beings and soul, like basically beings that can help you out along your journey in life. And it was profound and crazy. And at the same time, sometimes I would kind of get in touch with some of the terror that I felt of that drug experience. And so I think there was like some deep trauma that happened from the intensity of that experience that I was getting in touch with. And all the while, there's all these wild and crazy spiritual, mystical experiences happening. And so I go on like this for probably a good year or so and start following this Indian guru called Sadhguru, who's a famous guy who has a lot of followers on his YouTube channel and does retreats and workshops all over and really does a lot of, I'd say, traditional Hinduistic type practices that have to do with kind of magic and mantras and various sort of spiritual energy stuff. So I decide I'm going to go to basically put everything down and go to Thailand, go to Bali, go to India. And so I take about, at this point, I haven't been working for probably a year. And so I go to Bali first and go to Ubud, which is kind of this medicine, kind of eat, pray, love kind of place where there's cathartic, workshops and ecstatic dance rituals and a lot of meditation retreats and yoga retreats. And so at this point, I'm like, there's so much going on here. I just want to dive into it fully. So I dive into it fully, and I'm like eating more or less vegetarian at the time because of things I had read in about Ayurveda and energy and all that, how it relates to food and what you eat. And yeah, I was also going to these sort of self-helpy workshops at the time, and which was had much more of this kind of rational approach to like philosophical, rational approach to like healing and enlightenment. And it was so funny though, and like in retrospect, I would go to these things and I'd feel intrigued, but I would also not feel fulfilled. And it was like the more of these things I went to and did, the more I felt like I needed to do. And so by the time I get to Bali, I'm at the point of probably meditating, trying to meditate a couple hours a day, do these yoga practices, maybe another 45 minutes. And so it's getting into like more and more work and putting out crystals and trying to move energy and ground out energy, consistently throughout the days, and then do ecstatic dance to like release energy. And it's like the more I felt like I was finding, the more I felt like I was working to do more, to relate more intentionally, to eat healthier, to do more yoga, to do more meditation, to psychoanalyze more, to understand trauma, to journal more. And so, while that time was really beautiful, I met some good friends. It was like, it feels like a lot of work, like looking back on it. And so, in the midst of some of these experiences, it was like there were a couple energy healing sessions where Jesus would come up, where like the person leading the session would say, "Oh, like I just got this image of like Jesus. Like you should like put a picture of Jesus on the wall." And so this energy healer is kind of an open channel. They're just opening up, and so there's this moment I'm like, whatever, and I didn't really listen to that or pursue it. And then I had a profound kind of Buddhist meditation. This is all kind of before Bali, so leading up to it. So I'm jumping around a bit. But in this Buddhist meditation retreat, in between, this is probably 2017, middle of 2017, had just had some really wild experiences. where I started to kind of get in touch with the trauma from that psychedelic experience, but I also was like perceptual changes were happening, like seeing depth and colors in different ways. And there was this moment where I was starting to read this book called A Course in Miracles, which is this person that kind of takes a perspective on Jesus, and she channels this book, meaning she listens to another spirit guide, and she writes down what this spirit says. And so she writes this book back in the, I think, 70s. And it's about how Jesus was not actually talking about sin, and sin doesn't actually exist, and it's basically a lot of Hinduism and New Ageism kind of, but wrapped in Jesus colored clothes. And so I was reading that book, but it started to make me incline a little bit more towards God. And so I was starting to pray a little bit more and just like ask for help. And I'd say that was kind of like, in a way, it was a start of humility, of thinking there could be a God out there in a more intentional way. And so just had a really wild experience after that meditation retreat and starting to kind of do these meditation practices, but also kind of pray. And so I get back from that to California and I go to this energy healer, and there was this moment of, I'd say, intense bliss, intense kind of expansive bliss. And there's this moment of like this image of like these white chariot of horses comes in, and there's like a hand that like reaches down, and like it feels like it's touching somewhere in my heart that like hasn't just, I don't know, hasn't been touched, and but knows, like it was like all I wanted to do was grab this hand and like know that I'm safe. And then the energy healer woman, she was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, Chris, you're stay on the earth. You're going too high or something." And it was this weird moment of like, whoa, like I feel like I'm having this mystical experience that's true and profound, but also like touching a place in my heart that is deep and is able to receive some love and some sense of higher power. And but it was funny that she was the one who's sort of expert in energy and was saying that I'm like going off too far. And so like that stuck out to me in that moment. So these sort of little tidbits of kind of God, God-like types of experiences were happening, in specifically in the sort of Christian sense. And so anyway, I get to Bali, and I'm like, I'm gonna go to every energy healer I can find. So I go to this woman that has these crazy abilities to like, basically, it feels like she's electrocuting your whole body, but she's standing there with her husband, but it feels like being connected to like a power outlet. So like, but it wasn't that healing. I didn't get much out of it. And went to other people, they poke, sticks in your feet and tell you things about your life. And went to this tarot card reader, and she like said some stuff that really resonated with me, but she was also like, it was weird. She like brought up Jesus. She was like, like, there's something weird. She was like, there's something about you and Jesus. And at the same time, I'm like very much not pursuing anything Christian. I was like, wow, that's weird. Like I'm not, yeah. It's, I basically think of it as like, okay, I need to look at Christianity and think, how do I reconcile Christianity with all of these other faith traditions? Because surely they're all saying the same thing. And so that's kind of the perspective I'm going at it from, is like, Jesus was another guru or prophet like the Buddha or like Muhammad or Lao Tzu or all these different people. And so that was another moment that stood out to me. And so I have some, I don't know, more healing-y kind of mystical experiences like that in Bali. I come back, go to an energy healing retreat, go back to Thailand after that. And in Thailand, I went to some yoga retreats and really focused on like eating healthy and journaling. And it was around this time I was really getting in touch with, I would say, grief, trauma around my dad and around my childhood. And I went to this 10-day, it's called Inner Dance. It's like a sound-based healing ritual where this guy went and lived for a couple years on an island by himself and fasted from, I think, food and water for like a month straight, and had some crazy experiences, and then started realizing he could pass some of these experiences through this musical experiences where people just lay on the ground and have these sort of cathartic releases while he's DJing this music in a certain way where he like slows it down. In retrospect, I realized that was not good, in the sense that it's basically opening yourself up to wherever this sort of spiritual energy wants to take you. And there's not this question of like, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is it a good spiritual energy or bad spiritual energy? I was just open to anything and everything. And so while I'm in Thailand, I've kind of in those some of those experiences, I started to get in touch with deeper with grief, but it takes on this kind of feeling of like grieving my father, but also finding my father at the same time. And so they go deep into this like wailing grief. And but at the same time, there's this sense of a release of my dad in a way. And so that was beautiful. And it wasn't until I got back home, probably a month or so later, and I was going to make a video about my dad and about his passing and about all the places that he loved and used to go to and around where I grew up. And there was this one moment where no one was around. I was at my mom's house and I could grieve deeply and wail. And there was this moment of higher love that came in, and it felt like I was being held in that. And but it was fatherly and it was beautiful. And it was like I was just being held, and it was like I was letting go of all the ways that my father wasn't perfect and the anger and the frustration I had with him, but it was all being held in this deeper, peaceful way. And it was like fatherly love that was beyond, so far beyond my physical father. And I wouldn't say I related that with God so much at the time, but it was this moment of opening, I would say, and trusting. And so probably a week after that, I left and I went to India, and I did this 3-week Ayurvedic cleanse called a Pachakarma, where you do all sorts of things. So it's heavily steeped in Hinduism and their perspective on energy flow in the body and how food relates to prana and how energy moves. And at this time, I'm at the probably the height of my willingness to seek and strive towards truth. And I basically put down everything, and I was doing hours of meditation per day, hours of yoga per day, hours of, including stuff like getting up in the middle of the night to sit there and meditate on the nature of self and identity, and reading book. Who was the guy? Harshi. Then I was reading his book and reading some other ones by some other gurus and Sadhguru's books, and really meditating on the nature of self and saying these mantras. And I also started to pray though. And I would say in a sense that was sincere. I just started sincerely. It was like there was this hardness in me that I was trying to let go of. I didn't know if I needed to like forgive others, forgive myself. I was like dwelling on these things that I had done wrong or kind of missed the mark in my own life in retrospect, and trying to let go of some of that stuff to be free from it. And so I started to sincerely pray one night for forgiveness. And there was this moment of purity. It's hard to put words on, but it was like imagine when you're like hot and you go out for a run and you get back and you have a cold glass of ice water and it's so pure and fulfilling. It was like that. And it was like, I didn't know if it was coming from I guess it sort of felt related to the prayer, but I didn't know what was it tied to. If it was this tied to this Ayurvedic cleanse, to the yoga, to the meditation, to all of it combined. But it was like there was this balm that was touching my soul, and it was giving me real peace and freedom. And it was wild. And so it was this sort of spiritual world opened up in a profound way in that um, time. And so I keep doing these practices, and I like get up in the middle of the night and practice this sort of practice of observing of the self and the objects of mind in the sort of Buddhist way, and get to this point where it's sort of like I'm dwelling on the nature of the soul. And what is it like? A lot of Buddhists would say the soul is ultimately sort of like an attachment to, it's sort of your karma is, your soul is this attachment to the sort of crud of suffering that's built up over past lives, and ultimately you have to like let go of that. And so I was sitting in this terrified state in the middle of the night, feeling like I was supposed to be letting go of my soul, and at the same time feeling like on some deeper level I was like I shouldn't be doing that. And that that's not something to be letting go of myself. And so I go from that retreat to up to Coimbatore to Sadhguru, this famous guru, his ashram, and spend a few days there. And while I'm there, I am sitting in this place called the Dhyana Linga, which is this a big sacred temple that he's built, and he's erected this big, it's called a linga in the middle, and it's a statue to Shiva. And there's all these Hindus that are cycling in and out of this area, and they go from one side and dip into this spiritual cleansing pool, and they come there and they do some kind of worshipful practices. And so I went and sat in this space, and it was crazy. It was the day before on the way there, like I was just starting to have this sort of more mystical, visionary type of experiences. And on the way there, I literally saw an image of the road going into this temple in my mind, or mind's eye. And so then, like, whatever, an hour or two later, I get to that road, and it was like this profound thing. But these images were also kind of, I would say, had a quality of being messy and sporadic. And so, and almost fearful. And so I'm like, wow, there's some crazy things that are happening spiritually here. But I was just like, all right, I'm just diving in. And so I go sit in this big temple, and I'm sitting there, and I start praying, and I'd say surrendering, like letting go, like kind of being like, I'm like, I don't know, like being willing to just say, I don't know. And this peace, like this white presence comes over me. And it was like in my heart, I knew it was Jesus. Like it was unarguable. And I can't explain that in any other way except for just like my heart knew it. And it was like this, it was just like he spoke into my heart. He said, you're loved. You've